I'm your host, Riri. Welcome to Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose, where you'll find a community focused on resilience and perseverance, sharing untold stories of hope and rebuilding while dealing with major life interruption. This podcast is made by and for people in the process of reimagining their lives. We're here to raise the voices of those who often suffer in silence, living with chronic pain and/or disability. This space is for you. We encourage you to get involved. So stick around and let's jump right into the next episode. Welcome to this introductory episode of Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose. I'd like to welcome all listeners to this new podcast. This is your host, Riri, here to guide you through this journey of exploration. Numbers are pretty powerful. Did you know, according to the CDC, more than 50 million Americans live with chronic pain? That's 1 in 5, or 20% of the population. And, according to the CDC, 26% of the population have some sort of disability. Whether listeners themselves are affected or through a loved one, these numbers are pretty astounding. And these numbers are just rising. Clearly, we need better support systems for this growing group of Americans. For this first introductory episode, I'll provide some background and explain the vision for the series and give a preview of some of the exciting things to come in future episodes. Since we'll be talking about key words and phrases throughout the podcast, I thought we should explore the meaning of reimagining life and chronic pain and disability. Think of this episode like your orientation in a new class. I am a former teacher, but don't worry, there's no syllabus or homework, and participation is completely voluntary. One of the main goals of this podcast is to help those on the path of reimagining life find ways to help improve their quality of life. To that end, you'll hear stories from reimaginers and loved ones about how they approach or handle major changes dealing with chronic pain and other serious medical issues, and how they have reshaped their new, reimagined life. Reimagining life is a process that is different for each person, just as each person's condition is completely unique. Another key goal of this podcast is to provide both inspiration and support in the hopes that reimaginers will feel less isolated and inspired to apply others' lessons learned to their own situations. We aim to empower reimaginers to use their own voice. We'll talk about the experience of advocating for oneself in a very complex and flawed medical system, working through major obstacles and learning to adapt to new norms while finding a way to accept your new life, reimagined, often incredibly different from what it was. It's important to recognize that this new reimagined life is not what anyone expected or wanted. Reimaginers are now members of an elite club that they never wanted to join. We're here to say, yes, that club exists, and you're part of it, but that doesn't define you, and you're not alone. Since each reimaginer has their own unique set of circumstances, our focus will remain on the how. How do reimaginers deal with struggles? What lessons learned can be shared to help someone else on a similar journey? So we're all on the same page. Let's clarify some definitions. What is a reimaginer? For purposes of this podcast, a reimaginer is someone whose life was abruptly changed by a major medical issue or trauma. What do I mean when I say significant life change? Life changes can take different forms. Some include loss or changes in ability to work and provide financially for oneself or others, do basic daily self-care, pay bills, grocery shopping, keep track of appointments, manage mental health impacts, manage symptoms, complex conditions and documentation, and navigate the behemoth that is the medical system. So a reimaginer is literally someone who has or is on the path to reimagine their life in their new reality. What's disability? Talk about a controversial topic. Disabilities look different for each person. Two people with the same diagnosis can experience disability quite differently. There are many different types of disabilities and chronic illness. For example, there are those that are visible and invisible. The rule you can't judge a book by its cover is very relevant here. A visible disability or illness is something an outsider can see just by looking at someone, such as a person who uses a wheelchair or some sort of walking assistance tool. Invisible disabilities are harder to recognize because you can't tell a person has a disability or chronic illness just by looking. A person may appear, quote, normal without any visible impairment, but could be dealing with any number of things such as intense pain, nausea, anxiety, exhaustion, you name it. It's important to understand that disability and chronic illness do not fit into a one-size-fits-all box. There's a continuum of symptoms and challenges a person may be living with. This podcast will include people with all types of chronic illness and disability. Our focus is on the person and how they respond to their situations. So what will this podcast do? This podcast will provide a sense of community and support for reimaginers and their advocates. By sharing personal stories from other reimaginers, we hope the podcast will provide inspiration for dealing with whatever stage of the journey you're on. The podcast and social media community will provide links to resources and educate and inform by interviewing reimaginers and professionals who work with reimaginers. The podcast seeks to empower reimaginers who often face the following: lack of confidence and ability to plan ahead. The act of going through significant medical issue can make individuals very aware of how different their body is in this new and unwelcome reality. Living with chronic illness and disability creates an ongoing stress that wears on you over time. Doing what others consider, quote, normal daily life activities can be far more challenging for reimaginers. This added stress often influences one's ability to relate to social and family life, feeling of self-worth, and challenges their ability to plan for the future. Reimaginers also face isolation and stigmatization. Dealing with chronic pain and disability can be extremely isolating. It's easy to feel that those around you don't really understand what you're going through and often don't know how to engage with you. It's difficult for people to understand things that are completely foreign to them. It's also important to be aware that the isolation felt by reimaginers is further magnified by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Reimaginers may not be able to get the treatment they need, and social interactions and support may be drastically reduced for any number of reasons. So showing some kindness and offering inclusion might be very appreciated. We'll also highlight community members who are working to destigmatize living with chronic illness or disability through their art and work. It's pretty powerful to have someone who faces similar challenges to yours calling attention to what it's really like living as a reimaginer and trying to normalize that truth for the public. Each episode will focus on how a reimaginer deals with a specific challenge. We'll discuss how they faced the challenge, made adaptations, and how they worked through it or around it. You'll also hear from professionals who work with reimaginers, whether medical doctors, mental health practitioners, advocacy groups, writers, complementary healers, or other professionals. In each interview, they'll share the greatest challenges and offer good practices and tips for how to deal with these challenges based on their experience. Critical to our mission is to create a safe environment to share deeply personal stories. We live in the digital age, which is great in some ways, but also has some major downsides. Like, it's likely that more of your personal information than you'd like is already available online. Therefore, reimaginers sharing their personal stories have the option of using a pen name if that feels more comfortable. The important thing here is to maintain a supportive and non-judgmental environment. Lastly, one thing this podcast will not do is focus on medical conditions themselves, but rather on the reimaginer and how they've learned to live with and manage their conditions, and what steps they've taken to help themselves. The focus of the podcast will be on celebrating physical and emotional strength and growth, and the challenges and struggles faced, the wisdom that can be shared with others, and the hope required to start a new life. Living with chronic pain impacts all aspects of life, so the podcast will touch on many issues, including but not limited to health and well-being, mental health, trauma, society and culture, resilience and lifelong learning, and personal growth. We aim to support the individuals going through these difficult challenges as well as their advocates. So who is this podcast for? The podcast is designed by and for individuals who previously lived normal lives and are in the process of rebuilding. When something life-changing happens, it doesn't discriminate based on age, race, sex, socioeconomic class, or level of education, so neither do we. This podcast is meant for people whose lives have been changed, not by their own volition. Why do we focus on adults who previously lived normal lives? Because having to relearn basic skills is an especially difficult challenge for adults. We've spent years doing things a certain way, maybe decades, and all of a sudden, we have to start all over again. The world as we knew it falls apart. Going through that process is an important shared experience. So this podcast is for the young family where one parent went to work overseas and came back differently. The person down the street who battled COVID for months and is now suffering from long COVID. Or the young professional at the height of his or her career who, due to medical problems, can no longer work. Whether you yourself are a reimaginer, a caregiver to someone going through the reimagining process, or a family friend who wants to learn more about how they can better help a loved one, this podcast is for you. We hope this podcast will empower women and men and non-binary individuals, but women are statistically more likely impacted by autoimmune disorders and disability. People with disabilities and people who are trying to digest their new reality and want some new ideas or inspiration to help them make progress on their journey. So why make this podcast? Especially since it's pretty challenging to the creator. The idea for this podcast evolved out of my own personal experience and search for purpose. I found myself on my own multi-year journey of learning to live with chronic pain and trying to accept my new reality. This is a journey I'm very much still on, working each day to push myself further while also listening to my body. It's a very delicate dance. Over the course of trying many treatments, I discovered there's a growing group of people like me, often suffering in silence, without a voice or place to turn for help. These are the incredible stats I noted at the introduction, where I told you that 50 million Americans, or 20% of the population, live with chronic pain, and 1 in 4 Americans have some sort of disability. These numbers are huge, and as my advocates and I began to look for resources to help deal with my situation, it became clear that the U.S.'s health system, though one of the most advanced in the world, has many gaps and really is not designed to support people with disabling conditions. Unfortunately, these numbers are continuing to rise because of the number of people impacted by COVID-19 and the high percentage suffering from long COVID. Data and science are racing to keep up with growing variants and how to best respond to them. Just as we are learning as we go with COVID, many reimaginers, myself included, live in a state of flux. Small changes that an able-bodied person may not even notice can throw me out of commission for days or weeks. This makes it hard to hold any consistent schedule or make plans in advance. Information on everything from getting on disability, managing healthcare costs, where to find research trials or professionals that specialize in your needs, and so much more is scarce and difficult to find. We need to come together as a community and share as much as possible to promote the greater good. I wanted to find a way to share my experience and lessons learned to hopefully help others on their own journeys so that my years of suffering and fighting didn't go to waste. That's how the idea for the podcast was born. I'm very aware of the irony as I sit here wearing blinders while I type because I can't look at a computer screen without significant increase of symptoms. So why am I doing this, you might ask? Because I'm still not a person who backs down when facing a challenge. I've had to work on this episode many times in very short stints because of brain fog, vertigo, nausea, not being able to focus eyes or mind, and many other things. That's just part of being a reimaginer. It will truly take a village to launch this podcast. I'll need a lot of help. It will be challenging in many ways. But the idea that I could help others suffering gives me a sense of purpose. I'm grateful to all of my friends and family, near and far, who have helped piece together this massive puzzle thus far. You've helped me persevere and continue challenging myself further. I want to do the same for others. This podcast will focus on reimaginers living in the United States. However, resources shared might be relevant to others beyond those borders. A positive thing about living in the digital age is that many more people can be connected from all over the world. We'll share as many resources as we can, but please note that resources are based on individual recommendations, and we cannot validate reliability nor endorse particular sources. A key variable for success for reimaginers is the ability to focus on the present. It's easy to fall into the rut of trying to figure out how you'll feel in the future or when you'll be in X days, months, years, and getting completely overwhelmed. Though everyone's future is always unknown, the lack of stability reimaginers often feel is profound. Because the podcast is made by someone with a disability, it will take longer to produce and publish episodes. But I hope you'll bear with me. The goal is to release a new episode every 3 to 4 weeks. So what's your role? Since this podcast is made for you, we'd love to hear your feedback, questions, topic, or guest recommendations. Join our Facebook group, Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose. Like our Facebook page. Follow us on Instagram at Reimagining Life Podcast. To give you a taste of the kind of topics we plan to include, here are some examples of future episodes. Learning to accept your new reality and find new purpose. Changing the way we talk about pain and illness to make it more appropriate. Side effects are much more than just physical. What challenges or issues go along with living with chronic illness and pain? Complementary therapies. What types of therapies are out there and how do they work? Let's think outside the box. And leading by example, reimaginers actively breaking down barriers and empowering our community. Additional topics will evolve out of discussions and feedback. I hope this provides a rough outline of what we'll explore in this series. Our goal is to foster a supportive environment for individuals at any stage of their reimagining process to share resources, highlight untold stories, maybe share a laugh or two, and create and nurture a space and spirit of hope and community. I invite you to listen to the second episode, focused on the challenge of acceptance and finding new purpose. Though I don't want this series focused on me, I think it's only fair that I share a bit about my own story and how I ended up here. So come join the conversation where I'll share a bit of my story and challenges I've been battling. Let me start by saying I'm not a success story. I'm very much a work in progress. I still work on a daily basis to manage my chronic pain and all of the other symptoms and triggers that go along with that. To find out how I went from professional globetrotter to bedridden and am fighting my way back to a new life, come join me in episode 2. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose. We're always interested to hear your feedback and questions. So leave a review and drop us a note at reimagininglifepodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook or Instagram. We hope you'll tune in for the next episode.